защитим и наш народ, и нашу государственность от любых угроз.
Yevgeny Prigozhin has been laid to rest in St. Petersburg's Prokhorovskaya cemetery. It was a quiet ceremony. Vladimir Putin did not attend, but it marks the end of a chapter in the Ukraine war, but also the end of a chapter in contemporary Russian history. So what does Yevgeny Prigozhin's death mean for Russia?
Тех, кто погибли, их не заменить.
For Ukraine? For Vladimir Putin? And most of all, for the Wagner fighters who followed him and fought for him. So on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 23rd of August, reports came through that a plane had crashed in the Tver region, just northwest of Moscow. And it quickly became apparent that it was not just any plane, it was Yevgeny Prigozhin's private jet.
Среди пассажиров частного самолета, который разбился в Тверской области, значится фамилия Евгения Пригожина.
It later transpired not only was Mr. Prigozhin on board, his top allies, Valery Chekalov, Wagner's rear area logisticians chief, Dmitry Utkin, Wagner's top military commander, were also on board. In other words, the entire top layer of the Wagner mercenary outfit had been wiped out, blown out of the sky as they flew between Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there was not really much speculation about what happened to them. The consensus is pretty unanimous. Most people believe that Vladimir Putin ordered his assassination in revenge for staging a mutiny. It's now pretty clear that Yevgeny Prigozhin was a marked man ever since June 23rd this year, when he launched a mutiny, what he called his March of Justice.
Под контролем военные объекты Ростова, в том числе аэродром.
When he and several thousand Wagner volunteers turned their back on Ukraine and marched back into Russia, seized control of Rostov-on-Don and sent a flying column up the road towards Moscow. It was an extraordinary moment. For a few hours, we thought that Vladimir Putin's 23 years in the Kremlin were coming to an end. Was it a coup that could succeed? Would the Russian army stand and fight, or would they melt away in the face of these angry dogs of war, come to exact revenge for their maltreatment? We never found out what would have happened because 120 miles short of Moscow, Mr. Prigozhin cancelled the whole thing. A deal was done, brokered, we're meant to believe, by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. And the deal went something like this. Wagner would turn around and go home. Mr. Putin would not take revenge on them, but they would leave the country and go into a peaceful exile in Belarus. If you weren't a dictator fighting a disastrous but brutal war of aggression, that deal might have had some merit. But that is not how it works in Putin's Russia. The truth is that once somebody has challenged the president in such a brazen way, he had to be punished. Everybody was wondering why the president was so weak that he couldn't bring himself to properly punish the man who had apparently tried to overthrow him. And now we know what the answer is. Vladimir Putin was biding his time.
Пригожина я знал очень давно, с начала 90-х годов. Это был человек сложной судьбы, и ошибки у него были серьезные в жизни.
Why? Well, we can make an educated guess. He was probably trying to work out how deep the conspiracy went, how many senior army officers were in on this. So what's going to happen to Wagner without Yevgeny Prigozhin? I think probably Wagner is basically finished, and there's two reasons for that. The first one is about the brand. Wagner as a brand is basically now politically toxic in Russia. It's so indelibly linked with this idea of being slightly independent, of standing up to the Kremlin, of standing up to Vladimir Putin. That simply cannot be allowed to exist in Putin's Russia. So if you ask me, Wagner, the brand, the symbol, is going to be expunged from memory. In fact, I suspect it might become quite dangerous to say that you once fought for Wagner, because it's going to be considered a mark of potential disloyalty. The other reason is purely practical. Wagner was not the only private military company in Russia, but it had a unique advantage in Yevgeny Prigozhin's relationship with Vladimir Putin. They go back years, and actually the secret of Wagner's globe-trotting success was down to those links, that political patronage. And nobody else left in the Wagner hierarchy has that relationship with Putin. And access to Vladimir Putin is the currency of power in Russia. In the late 17th century, there was a military social group in Russia called the Streltsy, who mounted a mutiny against Peter the Great. And in response, they suffered massive executions, exiles, and even those regiments that had been loyal were completely disbanded. The Streltsy now, not a trace of them, not even a tradition within the Russian armed forces. That's probably what's going to happen to Wagner. And weirdly enough, the actual impact on the war in Ukraine is probably not going to be that noticeable. Wagner were pretty much exhausted after the Battle of Bakhmut. But while the impact on the war might not be that noticeable, I think the impact inside Russia is actually more important. First of all, for Vladimir Putin. Mr. Prigozhin played an important role for him. He was, as Mr. Putin himself acknowledged, a man who got results. He'd get stuff done in his corrupt, off-the-books way of doing things. Well, he's lost actually quite a competent fixer. But he had another important role, and that was basically intimidation.
Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
There's a reason that Mr. Putin let the feud between Mr. Prigozhin and Sergei Shoigu, the head of the Russian Defense Ministry, run for so long, and that was because it suited Mr. Putin. He needs somebody else keeping the army on its toes, keeping other members of the elite looking over their shoulder, and Mr. Prigozhin was really useful for that. I must say, having said everything I've just said, there is a mischievous part of me that is deeply uncomfortable with the way we've reported this story. I mean, since when did we take what the Russian state says as obviously true? And has anybody seen Mr. Prigozhin's body? And didn't we report just the other month about how he used to use body doubles and fake passports and would perhaps change planes at the last minute before getting on a flight? Maybe he's retired to run a bar on an African beach somewhere. History's already moved on. The consensus is already clear. And yes, he almost certainly is actually dead. And yet that niggling doubt is going to remain there. And for years to come, I'm sure people are going to be wondering, where exactly is Yevgeny Prigozhin?